Hi there, it's Pastor Reese, and we thank you so much for watching today. We know this message is going to be a blessing in your life. Enjoy.
Hey, Encounter Church, totally stoked to hang out with you this Wednesday night. And I know it's been a long time, so you've missed these jokes. Oh my. Okay, I know. We're all like groaning before I even start. And this one is definitely groan worthy. So here we go. What should you do if you're addicted to seaweed? Sea kelp. Sea kelp, get it? I know. Even Tyler's rolling his eyes because he heard it twice now. That's worse the second time. So here, you're like, let's get on with the message before we have to do more torture. I agree 100% with you. And I want to talk tonight about getting the upper hand. You ever think about having the upper hand? We think about that in relation to like work or having the upper hand at school or getting the upper hand, with the COVID 20 pounds we might have gained, something like that. But how do we get the upper hand? I think it's really relevant, particularly in this season, but actually I think it's true anytime because I think we all go through ups and downs, ebb and flow, unexpected things like COVID, all kinds of struggles and hardships and difficulties. And I think this year is particularly indicative of some of those challenges, things that we didn't expect coming out of left field. But I want to talk about how do you get the upper hand? I was thinking about this in relation to Joseph. And Joseph is a dude from Genesis, and we start reading about him in chapter 37. And basically, up through chapter 50, Genesis 50, is pretty much all about Joseph. I think Joseph is an interesting guy to think about having the upper hand. Because if you think about how he was raised, he was the 11th out of 12 sons, and he was his dad's favorite son. If you remember, he had the coat of many colors. His brothers were super jealous. And in some respects, Joseph set himself up for kind of getting, jealousy and all this stuff. But you think about it too, if you remember, he had some dreams about his family. He had a dream about grain sheaves bowing down to him. He told his brothers about it, and his brothers were like, jerk, we hate your guts. Made him all the more jealous and upset with him. And then he had another dream about the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him. And he told his brothers again, which I think is stupid. Why would you do that twice? And then he told his dad too, and his dad was like, what are you smoking, dude? So, you got Joseph, and some of it's probably a little bit of a maturity challenge for him. But I want to talk about some of the hardships he went through and the upper hand that he had. How do you get the upper hand, not just when things are going well, but how do you get the upper hand when things are not going well? And I think Joseph is very, very great example of how do we get the upper hand? Because you're probably going through things right now and you're like, I'd like to get the upper hand on my weight. I'd like to get the upper hand on my finances. I'd like to get the upper hand. And there's, some of the maybe emotional stuff on the inside. How do we get the upper hand? And so when we look at Joseph, you can say, well, he was, the fair-haired child. Everything worked out really well for him. But he had some significant plummets, some like potholes in his life that were not upper hand, like benefit, whatever. So you think about the first time we see him go through like a pothole, a major pothole, is when his brothers basically kidnapped him because they were so jealous, and they threw him in a pit. They were going to kill him, but they threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. I think that's bad. I think that's like super bad news. And you wouldn't wish that maybe on your worst enemy. But he went through this like major valley. And if you think about a young man who's ostracized by his brothers, not just ostracized, he's thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and he doesn't know if, when, never he'll see his family again, let alone his dad. And he gets sold into slavery and he goes down to Egypt. And that's bad news. How do you get the upper hand when everything hits the fan and you don't know what to do? Everything in front of you is falling apart, unraveling. How do you get the upper hand? But I want you to think about this. When he came down into slavery, into Egypt, Potiphar, that's the guy's name, bought Joseph. And when he bought him, it says that God was with Joseph. And you can read on multiple verses throughout Genesis, like in Genesis 29, verses 2 and 3. It talks about, 39, verses 2 and 3. It talks about how God was with Joseph. And then it talks as well that Potiphar recognized God was with Joseph. And even though he hit this major pothole, God was with Joseph, and God helped him have the upper hand. So he got promoted in Potiphar's house. And if you remember, the stuff that happened with his brothers, that was probably excessive. Like, that was unfair. They were too mean to him. But again, something goes south for Joseph in Potiphar's house. And he gets accused unfairly by Potiphar's wife of him trying to assault her. That didn't happen. And so again, he hits another pothole. How do you get the upper hand? I mean, you feel like things are starting to level out and be normal and stable. And then, you hit another turbulent season. What do you do to get the upper hand? So you watch him. How does he navigate this stuff? How does he navigate these potholes, these drops, these horrible things that go on? And I like what he says to Potiphar's wife, because when she attacks him, basically, he says, I'm not going to sin against God. There's a God awareness in Joseph's mind, and you see this repeatedly over the course of his life. So he gets thrown into prison. So again, we have these like potholes and these dips. But even in these dips, Joseph gets the upper hand. So he gets thrown into prison. Potiphar's house, that doesn't play out. He gets unfairly accused, thrown into prison. That's bad news. And what's he going to do down there? He's a foreigner. There's no judicial recourse, if you will. He's thrown into prison, but even in prison, God gives him favor. And the prison leader recognizes, hey, this guy, God is with this guy. And the prison leader promotes him to being in charge of the whole prison. So even though he goes through these difficult times and he goes through these potholes, is really significant that you watch and see him keeping his eyes on God. And really that helps him keep the upper hand. But even when he's in prison and he interprets the dream, which is phenomenal, interprets a dream for both the cupbearer and the baker, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, but the cupbearer who winds up living, he forgets him. And Joseph says, please don't forget me. But he does. He forgets him. And, it just seems like he keeps getting the raw end of the deal. Keeps getting this, bad things. And even though he gets sold into slavery, he pops up a little bit. Then he gets thrown into prison. He pops up a little bit. But he's still stuck there. And it seems like an endless, how's he ever going to get out? And then, Pharaoh has a dream. So I'm reviewing all this stuff for you because I want you to consider that Joseph, no matter what happened to him, he came and got the upper hand. But I want to just propose this to you. I want to suggest that the behavior and what he did in Potiphar's house, he behaved himself uprightly. He kept his eyes on God. He trusted God. His behavior in the prison, he kept his eyes on God. He got unfairly accused, but he kept his eyes on God. I want to propose to you that those couple scenarios were practice for his brothers. Because if you remember, this whole thing started when his brothers sold him into slavery. You can say, well, no, it was Joseph's fault because he was mean and insensitive about his dreams. I'll give you that for sure. But the stuff really unraveled when his brothers sold him into slavery. And if I were Joseph, I would struggle with being angry, bitter, and having unforgiveness towards my brothers. And if you think about it, Joseph, when he's in prison, I'll give you the quick little thumbnail on that. He gets out of prison because he interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh has a couple of dreams, and Joseph says, these are your dreams, and this is what they mean. And you need to have somebody that's going to take the administrative role to take care of all the abundance that's going to happen for 7 years because a famine is coming after that. That's kind of the short end of the story. So once they hit the famine, Joseph's he's second in charge of all of Egypt. Again, he gets the upper hand. Even though he's been sold into slavery, even though he's been a slave for how long, even though he's been in prison for how long, he still gets the upper hand. He keeps getting the upper hand. He gets promoted to second in charge over all of Egypt. And although Egypt has come through the abundant years, 7 years, now they're in the famine years. And, he's got everything organized and planned so that there are resources to hold them through those 7 years of famine, because Joseph knew from the dreams, interpreting the dreams. But partway through the famine, lo and behold, who shows up on the scene? His brothers. His brothers. And it says that Joseph remembered the dreams. And I have a sneaky suspicion that he was like, woo, these are the guys that, man, they put me through all kinds of hell. You know, I haven't seen my dad in how many years? All these horrible things that have happened to me. And I think there was a struggle in his heart. And you watch his behavior. It says he tested them. And he was abrupt with them. He accused them of being spies. And they're like, we're not spies, you know. And he really took them to the mat. And then, you know, he put the gold back in their sacks and they returned back. And then they still ran out of food. And he demanded that Benjamin, his little brother, come down before he gives him more food. And Jacob, the dad, is like, no. I already lost Joseph. My son Simeon is stuck in prison down there. And now you want me to lose Benjamin too? No way. And the other brothers say, we'll take him. We'll be responsible and you can trust that we're going to bring him back. So, but again, Joseph he's wrestling. I would say that he's wrestling in his heart. What's he going to do with his brothers? He's got their lives in his hands. And when his life was in their hands, they didn't do him right. He had the upper hand right now. He could totally pay back, get revenge, be cruel to them and mean and vicious. How do you get the upper hand? He's got the upper hand. Now, what do you do with that? So when Benjamin comes down, finally, after, angst on Jacob's part, Benjamin comes down. Joseph sees Benjamin, and there's this huge, huge thing. He has to pause himself and kind of go offline for a little bit to collect his emotions because he weeps when he sees his little brother. And finally, long story short, he reveals who he is to all of his brothers. Can you imagine what those brothers felt like? Oh, we thought you were dead. You're not dead. And now you're this super powerful man and we're coming to you for food. I mean, you think about it. And Joseph's like, I'll take care of everything. Bring dad down here because there's going to be a long famine. And I will make sure that our family is taken care of. And that's what happens. Joseph kept the upper hand. But I think sometimes when we go through those potholes and turbulent times, I think if we're not careful, we can stay in them based on our behavior, our attitudes, our perspective, or the way we get the upper hand. And I'm going to talk to you on how to do this in just a second. How do you get the upper hand when you go through turbulence, when you go through potholes? Because Joseph, he continually kept the upper hand. He did it when he was in Potiphar's house. He did it when he was in prison. And now he does it again with his brothers, with his dad, and he's completely the redemption of his family, keeping his whole family from starving to death and basically keeping the nation of Israel settled in place in a comfortable, safe place so that they can survive and prosper. And at the end in Genesis chapter 50, when Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers are super upset and nervous because they're like, hey, dad's dead. And maybe Joseph is going to take his revenge on us now because dad's out of the picture. And I like what Joseph says to them in verse 20. He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And I appreciate that Joseph, he kept the upper hand not only in his behavior, but also in his attitude and in his heart. So how do we keep the upper hand? How do we come out on top? How do we have that resilience? And I would suggest to you that the key to this is Romans 8:28. And this is what it says. We know that God causes all things to work together for good. Number one, for those who love him and for those who are called according to his purposes. And what I see with Joseph, I see Joseph and theme in his life, no matter what he goes through, prison, he goes into slavery, when things are going well in Pharaoh's house, he keeps his eyes on God. And I would challenge you and me that we stay in love with God. This is what Paul says in Romans 8:28, that we love God. And this word love is agape, and it's the present tense verb in Greek, which means continuous behavior, continuous, ongoing. It doesn't, not blips and kind of ups and downs, that we continually stay in love with God. And no matter what happens, no matter what's going on around us, no matter the pitfalls and the turbulence, let's keep our love with and for God fresh. And if you're struggling with that, I'm going to pray at the end here for both of us that we keep our love for God fresh. But the other thing I would say too is that God says, stay true to God's purposes in your life, God's design. How is God organized in you on the inside? It doesn't mean that we don't change and grow and mature. We do. Of course we do. Joseph absolutely did. But I believe that God puts design and purpose inside each of us. Unique design and purpose. Part of it, you look at Joseph, God gave him a unique talent, ability to interpret dreams. And Joseph stayed true to that. He interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. He interpreted the cupbearer's dream, the baker's dreams. He could have said, this dream thing was bad news for me because my brothers got upset and jealous with me about it, so I'm not doing that anymore. He was true. He didn't do that. He said, I'm true to God's purpose, God's design in me. And sometimes the design that God puts in us, God's purposes, sometimes on the outside, it doesn't always look smooth and comfortable and celebrated and accepted. But when we are true to God's purposes, God's design in our hearts, how God put the blueprint in us, when we're true to that, when we stay in love with God, then no matter what happens, the turbulence and the pitfalls, God helps us to have the upper hand. Because it says it, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and who stay true to his purposes. So I would just encourage you tonight, I'm going to pray for you in a little bit, that we would love God continually and that you and I would both stay true to God's blueprint design in us, no matter what happens around, no matter the pitfalls, no matter what's going on, COVID or not, any kind of political upheaval, social upheaval, economic upheaval, that we stay in love with God and true to God's design and purpose. Because Joseph is a great example of keeping the upper hand. No matter what happens in whatever happened in his life, he kept the upper hand because I believe he stayed true to God's purpose in his life, as well as staying in love with God. So I would say 2 takeaways. Number 1, stay in love with God. Number 2, stay true to his purposes in your life. So I want to pray for you, and then we'll finish up. Father, I thank you so much for each person watching tonight. I pray for each individual viewer, myself included, that you would help us to stay in love with you no matter what's happening in our lives, no matter externally or internally, that we stay true to your purposes and that we stay true and in love with you. Help us to walk in forgiveness, people who have hurt us, whether it's in purpose or not. Help us to walk in forgiveness. Help us to let go of resentment, anger, bitterness, and help us to stay in love with you and consistent with your design and purpose in our lives. Thank you for helping us with this. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, friends and family, thanks so much for watching. Reese is on this Sunday. It's going to be super powerful. If you haven't hooked up to an encounter group, that'd be fantastic for you to grab one of those. Remember to like us on YouTube, do the notifications, subscribe, do the Facebook thing. We love your guts, and we'll see you Sunday, either online or in person. Thanks again. Don't forget to do reservations too if you want to come in person. We love you. Have a great week.
Well, thank you for watching today. We pray that this message was a blessing to you and your family. We invite you to watch us again on Facebook or on YouTube. And if you haven't yet liked our Facebook page or are subscribing to our YouTube channel, please do so now. God bless you and your family. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.